So let's talk about reparations. Recently, there has been a debate on whether or not reparations should be awarded to African Americans for the centuries of mistreatment they have faced here in America. Unfortunately, much like we have seen with critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, and the word woke, naysayers have managed to bastardize the discussion and then use their version as the basis for all the counter-arguments they present. So let us take a moment to put this debate back into its proper context. To do this, I will take some of the well-known talking points we see on social media and overlay them with some factual information that can be used in the future for the next time you are confronted with these lies and half-truths. 1. Slavery was a long time ago. This is an argument I've seen replayed across the internet for a number of years now, so it's a great starting point for us as it is one of the most used arguments you'll see. The funniest part about it is that the push for reparations for freed slaves has been going since 1778. That's right, the Quakers, who were some of the first American abolitionists, felt that freed ex-slaves should receive reparations in the form of cash payments, land, and shared crop arrangements. One prominent person in this movement was Warner Mifflin, who is often called the father of American reparationism. Of course, his efforts were ultimately ignored. During the 1850s, many abolitionists were vocal about the need to compensate the few slaves that were awarded emancipation. One example would be Elihu Burritt, who proposed a plan of compensated emancipation in which money from the sale of public lands could be used to compensate both slave owners for their emancipated slaves and for the slaves themselves to help them get a fair start as free men. The plan got some support in the border states, such as Missouri and Delaware. It was even endorsed by Connecticut's State Emancipation Commission in 1859. So what happened? Yep, you guessed it. Now, immediately after the Civil War, reparations were given to some 40,000 freed slaves via Special Field Order Number 15. In 1865, these ex-slaves were awarded unneeded mules and a total of 400,000 acres of land. This is where the much-heard phrase, 40 acres and a mule, originated from. And for a brief time, it gave Black people the hope of reconciliation and prosperity. Of course, students of history already know that actions like these sent white supremacists into a frenzy that led to the assassination of an American president and the swearing in of Andrew Johnson. In short order, the lands that the American citizens were promised were taken from them in the blink of an eye. In 1896, the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty and Pension Association put up a valiant effort to obtain pensions for former slaves for their unpaid labor and suffering. One of their initiatives was a class action lawsuit, Johnson v. McAdoo, for a sum of $68 million. This number sounds quite large for that time, but it really only represented the taxes on cotton collected from 1862 to 1868. The argument was that the money was owed to the plaintiffs because the cotton produced during that time had been harvested by these ex-slaves and their ancestors as a result of involuntary servitude. Pretty good argument, right? Especially considering that the suit was based on such a small time frame. So did it work? Take a guess. Not at all. They continued to fight the good fight until the 1930s. At that point, it became blatantly obvious that America, by then deeply engrossed in Jim Crow, had no interests in making right the many wrongs that occurred before and after the Civil War. At some point, enough time had passed that denying reparations became easier and easier. By the 1980s, the phrase, "that was a long time ago," began to take hold. The beauty of it is that it allows naysayers to throw up their hands as if they would have been for the concept were it not for the fact that so much time had passed since the end of the Civil War. Notice how it conveniently ignores the fact that the Apprenticeship System wasn't fully eradicated until 1937, peonage slavery ended in 1940, and forced sharecropping didn't end till the 1950s. The point of reference always dates back to 1865. We can see the same sleight of hand played out today. For instance, we know that after the end of chattel slavery in 1865, many new inventive ways were created to allow white people to enjoy their status above Black people as they continued to be the sole or majority beneficiaries of their sweat equity. We have the Apprenticeship System, which sounds very harmless when you think about it in its more traditional sense, but it served a much more nefarious purpose when applied to African Americans. For them, it was presented as an intermediary step from slavery to freedom, where the supposedly free person was forced to apprentice under their former masters and be compensated for their labor. The reality of this, though, was that Black people were generally treated much the same as before. These supposedly free ex-slaves often had their families split up. yet again as their children were apprenticed under various family members of their former slave masters. Thousands of black children were legally and sometimes illegally removed from their homes and placed under the service of white adults. This tragedy of justice continued till the 1930s. Around that same time, white supremacists came up with the idea of using the concept of peonage or debt servitude. This law stated that if a black person owed a debt to a white person, they could be compelled by the court to work for that white person until they paid off their debts. Now, as you may recall, black people had virtually no rights in the court of law when it came to dealing with white people. Because of this, any white man could just accuse a black person of owing them money. If this went to court, the black person was sure to lose, unless he perhaps had another white man who could vouch for him. Upon losing, he would be forced to work for that white person until he paid off whatever amount was claimed to be owed. And guess who got to decide when that amount was paid off? Yup, this disgrace didn't end until the 1940s when America faced embarrassment during World War II when their own practices began to be scrutinized next to Hitler's. Even then, the practice basically continued under sharecropping. Now, sharecropping is another concept that worked differently with white people versus the black ones that were subjected to it. With white people, sharecropping was hard work that allowed them, as tenant farmers, to have access to land ownership by proxy. But for black people, things were much worse. Remember that black people couldn't vote during this time. They were largely powerless. This allowed white farm owners to basically treat the black farmers however they wished. As an example, if the white land owner decided to pay the black farmer half of what was owed, or even none of his owed money, there was virtually nothing that the black farmer could do. And to complain too loudly about it could lead to him being attacked or even lynched. And don't forget about those ever-present peonage laws. If the black farmer had a bad crop and had to borrow money, they ran the risk of being put even deeper into the throes of slavery. And to make matters worse, they often couldn't quit or leave without being drugged back like a runaway slave. This lasted until the 1950s, although there are reports of it existing as late as the 1960s. So let's talk about convict leasing. Immediately after the end of chattel slavery in 1865, blacks were subjected to what became known as black codes, which were designed to restrict the rights and mobility of the newly freed black population. Basically, either you agreed to be a slave, you were roped into slavery through the methods I listed out earlier, or you ran afoul of the loitering, vagrancy, or pig laws, which would land you in jail and ultimately put you into the convict leasing program to work as a prison laborer for the term of your prison sentence. Only now you were expendable and your life was worth less than the average slave. These poor souls were often worked to death, only to be replaced with the next person who was poor and hungry enough to get caught stealing a chicken or pig to feed his family. Keep in mind that this wasn't the punishment for all criminals, just the black ones. In fact, the reason why this form of slavery ended was because a white man, Martin Taber, got caught up in the system and was subsequently beaten violently to death by the overseer of Putnam Lumber Company in Clara, Florida. Thousands of black people were killed under this system with no hope of recompense. But the death of this white man signaled the beginning of the end of the convict leasing program. This profitable but deadly program wasn't ended till 1941. So while you will often hear people saying that slavery ended 159 years ago, they fail to mention that people were subjected to various other forms of slavery no later than 64 years ago. Again, though, reparations aren't just about slavery. But even if it were, I've pointed out that most of the rhetoric we hear today is really just misdirection created for the purpose of creating a narrative that suits the needs for people whose wealth was made from the suffering of the black people they are disenfranchising. With that in mind, let's cover some other topics that are worth consideration for reparations. 2. The disenfranchisement of black people. After the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were enacted to abolish slavery and grant citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. However, white supremacists implemented various tactics to systematically disenfranchise black people and maintain racial oppression from 1870 well into the 1990s and beyond. An example of this would be Atlanta, Georgia, where gubernatorial hopeful Hoke Smith used his position as the publisher of the Atlanta Constitution to often announce that, upon winning, his first job would be to disenfranchise the black community by eliminating the Negro vote in Georgia. His heated rhetoric helped kick off what has become known as the Atlanta Massacre back in 1906. Which leads me to my next point. 3. Voter suppression and intimidation. Despite the 15th Amendment, Southern states enacted laws and policies designed to prevent black people from voting. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses were used to disqualify African Americans from voting. Voting is an essential right of all American citizens, and I'm sure we all know the phrase, "no taxation without representation." Ask yourself, what representations were afforded to the black population after the end of Reconstruction? But for over a century, that money was collected and used to help disenfranchise black people. Black people who tried to exercise their rights often faced violence, intimidation, and murder from groups like the Night Riders and the Ku Klux Klan. This form of terrorism can easily be traced all the way till the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 4. Economic exploitation. It bears mentioning again that African Americans faced significant barriers to economic advancement, including limited access to education, employment opportunities, predatory lending and housing. Sharecropping, convict leasing, and other exploitative labor practices kept many black people in a cycle of poverty and dependence. Many black people were barred from jobs that didn't have an element of subservience to it. If you were black, your options were often limited to driver, field hand, Pullman porter, waiter, cook, butler, maid, janitor, factory or steel mill worker, or maybe a barber. Even Vivian Thomas, the now world-renowned heart surgeon, was forced to masquerade as a janitor while others took credit for his work. 5. Lynching and racial violence. The period from 1877 to 1950 saw a rise in lynchings and other forms of racial violence against African Americans. Let's name a few. There's the Colfax Massacre of 1873, the Atlanta Race Massacre of 1906, followed by the racial cleansing of Oscarville, Georgia in 1912, the Springfield Race Riot of 1908, the East St. Louis Race Riot of 1917, the Chicago Race Riot of 1919, which was just one part of the Red Summer riots where black victims were attacked by white mobs throughout the U.S., the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, the Rosewood Massacre of 1923, and the Harlem Race Riots of 1935, 1943, and 1964. Worse yet, these acts of terror were used to maintain white supremacy and intimidate black people into submission. Ida B. Wells, a prominent African-American journalist, suffragist, and civil rights activist, believed that the racial violence, lynchings, and discriminatory practices in the United States were part of a deliberate effort to disenfranchise black people while simultaneously enriching white people. Wells argued that lynching was closely tied to economic interests. White landowners, industrialists, and business owners benefited from a system that kept black labor cheap and exploitable. By terrorizing black communities, they ensured that black workers remained subservient and powerless. Preventing black communities from voting was merely a continuation of that strategy, as it left black workers powerless and ultimately subservient to the whims of white people. 6. Separate but equal. Anyone that knows anything about the history of black people in this country is acutely aware of this concept. The problem with the separate but equal doctrine was that it provided a legal justification for racial segregation under the guise of equality. Although the doctrine claimed to provide equal facilities for both black and white Americans, in reality, the facilities and services for black individuals were often vastly inferior. The quality of the segregated facilities for black Americans ranged from substandard to deplorable, and they did not receive the same level of investment or maintenance as those for white Americans. Take the schools that black people attended as an example. In the same city where white people attended elementary and high schools that were nicely furnished with new books and desks and chalkboards, the black schools often had outdated books, no desks or even running water, and sometimes didn't even have electricity. Even though laws were passed to end segregation in America back in the mid-1960s, serious efforts were not made towards ending school segregation until the 1970s. And many schools were still segregated well into the 1990s. I could continue by talking about redlining, predatory lending practices, job and pay inequality well into the 2000s, police brutality, the defamation of the black image through the media, and the drug wars of the 1980s. But we will save that for another day. Let's end with a quick recap of what reparations are for. Making amends, the act of making up for a wrong one has done by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. If that is the purpose for reparations, then there are few groups in America that have a higher claim to them. We've chronicled a clear line of mistreatment that can be attributed to not only slavery, but to the continued hatred and disenfranchisement of black people from 1865 to the 1990s, and could have gone further were it not for time constraints. In the future, If you find yourself in a disagreement with someone about reparations, please use what you've learned today to set the record straight. Thank you for exploring this topic with us. Drop a comment below letting us know if you learned anything new today. Also, let us know what other people or topics you'd like to see showcased in an upcoming episode. Finally, don't forget to subscribe so that you'll be notified when a new video is posted.